thing I want to talk about is I'm canceling class on Thursday. So today is the last time we meet this week, in large part because your final paper for the racism in nursing is due this Sunday by midnight. Right? You can use the Life Happens class if you need it, but that means you are stuck working on this paper into the fall break. Ideally, you don't want to be doing that, and I think most of you can get it done on time. And a few of you have already submitted it. So if you've already submitted, you're done, you're fine. Everybody else, though, I know some of you wanted to come meet with me with your drafts, and that's why I'm canceling class on Thursday to create time and space where I know you all can come and talk to me if you want to. If you haven't gotten the meeting with the professor done, this is the perfect time to do it. Even if you don't have any questions, even if there's nothing in like the comments I gave you in your rough draft that we need to talk about, it's still good. I can take a quick look at your draft, kind of double check everything and give you the go ahead to continue. So don't forget that 10% of your grade is based on meeting with me at some point this semester. Most people leave it to the end, which is why I'm also spending some time canceling classes the last few weeks of the semester. That way there's no excuse. You can come during office hours, you can come during class, or you can set up a different appointment time to meet with me. I think I've talked enough about what expectations I have for the final draft. But again, if you have questions, please do not hesitate to come talk to me about it or to even ask me over email. I'm also accepting, like if somebody wants me to take another look at their paper and you want to email it to me, that works too. The only thing I ask when it comes to emails is that if you're going to send me another draft, that you give me at least 24 hours before it's due, because it takes longer to look at these drafts and to give feedback on them. So give me at least 24 hours so that I get a chance to send back feedback. Let's see. I think that's it in terms of the racism in nursing paper. I also want to start talking about the belly of the beast analysis. So instead of a final exam, so we're not having a final exam, instead you are writing a 2 to 3 page paper based on the documentary Belly of the Beast. So over the break, if anybody wants to work on it, I know some of you are ahead and you can start working on it. You can, I'm going to give you time after the break to watch the actual documentary, but you can watch it over the break. You'd want to click on that link, and then you have to sign in with your Cal State LA credentials, right? And let me put in mine. And that should work because you're signing on through the Cal State LA from off campus. If you've already signed into like the library, then you won't have to do these steps. But if you keep going through the steps, press play, it'll come up. I've been doing this, testing this out this week, and it seems to be working. Sometimes I've only ever had one person who hasn't been able to use the Canopy website, and it sometimes has to do with like if your computer is very old or the browser hasn't been updated recently. If something like that happens, and you absolutely like just cannot watch the movie, let me know. I do have the DVD of it, so I could potentially play it over Zoom. But I'd rather just like give you the time, cancel a class, give you time to watch it. It's about an hour and 20, 21, 22 minutes here. And then what I want to point out is that this is a formal paper, right? So I do want the format of a formal introduction with a thesis statement, body paragraphs, and a conclusion. It's not a research paper though. So you are not supposed to be doing research on the topic. You already have all the information you need, or you will have all the information you need to write this paper. Right. What I'm going to ask you is the documentary covers the more recent cases of women in prison who have been sterilized without their consent in California. Well, we've already seen how there's a long history of these forced sterilizations. And so the question I'm asking you in the prompt is, why do they continue happening? The cases in the documentary are not old, they're recent, they're in the 90s, early 2000s. So why do they continue to happen? Based on the history we've been analyzing, based on the documentaries you've seen, what is your answer? So it is an opinion, but it's an informed opinion, right? Based on the information we've seen here. I do want you to use information from the documentary and material from class. You have to use material from class somewhere in your paper, right? Because we've talked about the other cases in California, for example, and we will be talking more about this. You want to use the stuff we've been talking about in class. So it's something I just wanted to go over very quickly today in case anybody plans on working on it over the Thanksgiving break. I want to give people the opportunity to work on it early so that it hopefully eases some of the burden of final exams week. It's going to be due for us, it's due Thursday of final exams week. So December 15 by midnight. Right. So do your future self a favor. Start working on it earlier. Much shorter than the racism in nursing paper, so hopefully it goes easier. But if anybody works on it earlier, you can also ask questions, email me, all of that fun stuff. Any questions so far? No? Okay. I'm like, I know probably people who aren't on the Zoom might later have questions. But today I want to talk about the history of abortion. The history of abortion, every time I tell a class that we're going to be discussing this, I usually get a lot of panic expressions, panic reaction, immediate reactions. And the thing is, my goal in talking about this history is not to change anybody's opinions. Most people, when it comes to abortion, if you already have an opinion on it, that's unlikely to change because people base their opinions on personal experiences, on political positions, on religious and moral positions. And if that's the case for you, then my goal is not to change your mind. My goal is to emphasize that abortion has a history. A lot of times in public discussions of abortion, we ignore the history and we talk about it purely as a political or as a religious or moral issue and forget that there is a really long history and we actually have a lot of information on the experience of abortion throughout history and across the world. We just do. That we're always looking for more, but we already have actually a ton of information, especially from the more modern eras. There are some issues here in terms of getting some of this information or where there are holes in our knowledge, but there is a lot already here. So let's get to it. One of the most important elements is that history of the law. Right? When you look at both the Roe v. Wade decision in the US and the most recent Dobbs decision, in both opinions, the Supreme Court used history to support the decision they were making. And when you read those decisions, most people don't read them, but I'm going to show you, we're going to discuss certain parts of those decisions later. Sometimes the history that the Supreme Court used was good, and sometimes it was really bad. Like one of the things that historians right away were shocked in the most recent Dobbs decision was, and now I'll skip ahead so I can show you. In the Dobbs decision, this is a paragraph from section 2 of it. It says, actually, let me go to this one. Here it is, section 2. It says, next, the court examines whether the right to obtain an abortion is rooted in the nation's history and tradition, whether it is an essential component of ordered liberty. The court finds that the right to abortion is not deeply rooted in the nation's history and tradition. Well, this right there, any historian who studies this will tell you it's flat out wrong. There is a long history and tradition in the US of abortions occurring, going back to before the arrival of Europeans. right? Getting some of this information documented is at times a little bit difficult because Native American knowledge of contraception and abortion was passed down orally. So we don't have a lot of written sources of the knowledge that Indigenous communities have had for a long time. But we do know that there was a long knowledge, that they had accurate information on how to induce an abortion. How do we know this? Because the knowledge was passed down. And a lot of times they were using names for herbs and roots that are no longer in use, like in common use, but we can trace those down, right? In fact, we have ancient sources. We have sources from Egypt, from ancient Greece, from China, from all over the world, in which people did write down what herbs and roots were being used to provoke an abortion, to induce an abortion, to end a pregnancy. And even when it's not the right name, we've been able to figure out what the modern equivalent of these are. Like, what were those herbs and roots? And it turns out that a lot of those herbs and roots still exist today. And when scientists have tested those herbs and roots, it turns out, yeah, they would have worked. They would have worked and been effective at ending a pregnancy. The problem why we don't tell people go use these herbs and these roots to if you want an abortion today is because a lot of these can be really dangerous. You have to use them correctly and in the correct dosage. Ancient people had to base that on trial and error. So we know some people had to have died using some of these herbs and roots in order for people to get to the right dosage and the right amounts. And a lot of times when people wrote down recipes for things like teas and different kind of concoctions, they wouldn't write down exact quantities. And so you can't, while you might be able to find stuff online, it's not advisable. It can be really dangerous. Some of these herbs and roots, if you take too much of it, like you die. So you don't want to do that, but we know that there's this long history of using herbs and roots that would have been effective. In the United States, after arrival of Europeans, there was no law prohibiting abortion. Right. And in a lot of Native communities, actually, there was also no prohibition and no stigma around abortion issue. For example, the Crow in Montana, not only was it not an issue, abortions were not an issue, but it was seen as basically the pregnant person's decision. They're the ones that got to decide whether they would continue with the pregnancy or not. The rest of the community just supported those decisions. But even after European arrival, that didn't change. There was no specific law in the US banning abortion. Right? And we know that it was happening. We know that it was happening. It was widespread. There was a lot of American law, and states' laws all over the US are based on a British common law. And in British common law, an abortion was completely legal and okay before quickening. That was the term they used, before quickening. That what that means is before there's movement in the womb, before the pregnant person can feel the movement of the fetus. That essentially opened up really wide parameters for when an abortion would occur, because some pregnant people never feel movement of the fetus. It may sound like a weird thing, but I have one of my best friends who in her first pregnancy could not feel the baby move. She said she did not. And so if there was ever a question in English common law of whether the pregnant person had reached the point of quickening or not, they would ask the pregnant person, hey, has quickening occurred? Could you feel the movement? Well, you'd have to take the word of the pregnant person for it. How would the judge, how would the law, the police know whether the pregnant person could feel the fetus moving or not? You have to take their word for it. As a result, those laws were very permissive. Like people use them to probably have abortions that were past the first trimester. In the United States, we know that midwives and other healthcare professionals were routinely performing abortions, right? A lot of it, even though it was not illegal, it was taboo, but it was out in the open. When you look at newspapers of the time period of like the 18th and 19th centuries and into the 20th century, when you look at all the media from that time, there were advertisements for abortion-inducing potions or liquids throughout that time period in newspapers, in magazines, in flyers. People would pass around flyers advertising that they had something you could take to induce an abortion. Now, like I said, it was taboo. So typically these advertisements would not use the word abortion. Instead, they use euphemisms for abortion. So they would say things like how to get your period back. Why is that a euphemism for abortion? Well, because during pregnancy, there's no menstruation, there's no period. There might be some spotting, but no period. And so the euphemism that's very typical in the US and in all over the world was, okay, well, we're doing then, what an abortion does is it returns your period. And that's true, by the way, even in ancient Greek and Roman sources. That's what they would call it instead of using the word abortion. But so typically done. However, because anybody could create these and try to sell them to people, it's not until the 1820s and 30s that the first laws begin getting passed to regulate that. So in the 20s and 30s, the laws were not specifically banning abortion, right? They were not making abortion illegal yet. But there were these poison control laws that begin banning the sale of these concoctions of abortifacients. These are like abortion-inducing products. Because what was happening in the 19th century was that just random people would try to sell cures, remedies, and these abortion-inducing products. And if you were buying it from someone off the street, for example, there was no guarantee that they were selling you something that worked or that was safe. And these kinds of people were common, like they would try to sell you, cures for the common cold, things like that. And sometimes if people bought it from disreputable sellers, they could be getting poisonous concoctions. Somebody who didn't know what they were doing could really hurt people. That's why these poison control laws were passed. So they weren't banning abortion, they were restricting the sale of these quack remedies. It's not until the 1860s, so basically at the start of the Civil War, is when you start getting laws that ban specifically abortion. Right. So it's really interesting that timing is not a coincidence. There is a racial element to these laws. Actually, a lot of different elements to this laws. One of the main groups lobbying for these laws, so actively trying to get these anti-abortion laws passed, were doctors. In fact, one of the biggest groups supporting these laws was the American Medical Association. Why do you think doctors would want to ban abortion? They were trying to make it illegal. Why would doctors as a group be trying to do this? Any ideas? It might seem odd, like, why are doctors doing this? They're not doing it, was not out of religious convictions. It turns out this is part of their effort to establish their authority. This is the time period in which they were going after people like midwives and other people that were practicing medicine. They wanted all of that to stop because in the 19th century, there was a majority of people in the United States were not going to doctors for when there was something wrong with they had any medical issues. They were not going to doctors. They were going to people like midwives. especially on things like delivery, abortion, contraception. They were going to midwives. Midwives are already trusted. They were trusted on these topics, and a lot of people did not trust doctors. Right. So, or they might not have access to a doctor. Right. So the American Medical Association is trying to force people to stop going to others. They want people to start going to doctors, trained doctors for medicine. Part of it is probably also financial, right? Like doctors wanted to earn a living, and if they don't have enough patients, then their practices aren't going to succeed. And so they make it like illegal. For example, the laws get passed that make it illegal to go to a midwife or to buy these potions from other people. They want it's part of the professionalizing process and establishing the authority of doctors. So that was one of the key pushes for it. It was also a anti-feminist reaction because at this time there was a growing feminist movement. The suffrage movement had begun to intensify, women demanding the vote. And the idea is, wait a minute, these women are getting a little bit carried away here. We need to reestablish women's role in society. Right? These women are starting to talk about vote and citizenship, and we don't want that. So these anti-abortion laws were a way to remind everybody and to kind of enforce this idea of women's roles primarily being as mothers and wives. Right? That this is the role women have in society, and the laws are kind of emphasizing that. Xenophobia was another key element, though. The racist element begins popping up here because at the time there was a new wave of immigration from places like Italy, right? And those Italians coming to the United States were Catholic. Now tell me, why are a bunch of Catholics coming to the US a problem for nativists, for Americans that are against immigration at the time? Why would Catholicism be a problem? I'm like, it's so weird because we don't necessarily have these ideas anymore. Well, some people do, but there was a lot. Oh, is somebody putting it in the chat? There were, yes, a lot of these nativists, these anti-immigration people groups were Protestant. And remember that they see the Italians as racially inferior, right? These are racially inferior immigrants coming in large numbers to the US. And on top of it, they're Catholic. They're papist, and there's a long history of once the Protestantism, right, is created, breaks away from the Catholic Church, and there's a lot of conflict between Catholics and Protestants in Western Europe, and a lot of the conflict continues into the 19th century and into the United States. On top of it, what was happening in the 19th century in the US was a lot of Protestant women, a lot of Protestant families were choosing to not have a lot of children. They were having fewer children, smaller families. These new Catholic immigrants were having large families. Right? That's common all over the world with Catholicism, in part because of the Catholic Church's stance on things like contraception and abortion. But this created fear about the demographics of the US, right? These Protestant anti-immigrant groups were afraid. Not only are these immigrants coming in large number, but they're having large families, 10, 12 plus kids. They're gonna take over the country, was the fear. We cannot have that. So how does banning abortion help that? The idea was Protestant women need to start having more children so we can compete with the Catholics. If the Protestants have more children, then the Catholics won't outnumber the Protestants, and we can keep this country safe, was the idea, right? I'm not saying that. These people were saying it. And it's funny because that still continues to be like the issue when you see discussions of demographics now, when people talk about how Americans are having less children. Notice how the undercurrent, the thing that sometimes is not being said out loud, but is there, is that immigrants coming to the US, especially Latino immigrants, tend to have larger families. Sometimes, especially if there's a Catholic tradition, like there is in a lot of places in Latin America. And so this push to ban abortion, it's a demographic fear that white people will be outnumbered and that white women need to be having more children. I'm like, just keep an eye out for that every time you see people complaining about like millennials not having children, or in the future, Gen Z ends up following those same patterns. And on top of it, now with the Civil War and the ending of slavery, there was also that fear of Black populations, right? Fear of Black populations. And so it's very much about race. It's never a coincidence that a lot of anti-abortion laws get passed at the same time as that there are growing fears of the number of white children being born. You see this all over the world, in places like France, for example, that was a strong fear, and elsewhere. Not everywhere necessarily. I haven't studied every place in the world when it comes to this issue, but every time I see this fear about, oh, people aren't having enough kids, usually it means white women are not having enough kids. And it coincides with periods of new abortion bans. These are so this is a chart of states that were banning abortion. So a majority of states here were banning abortion. Some you can see as early. Connecticut begins banning abortion or passing laws banning abortion in 1821, but then other states wait longer. Delaware doesn't pass a law until 1883. Let's see, where's California? California's law is passed in 1849. So you can see there's 1879. So some are passing laws earlier, but most of them you see are happening around like 60s, 70s is when a majority of these laws get passed. So roughly around the Civil War era and after. Now so we know abortions were happening everywhere, but figuring out exact numbers is really difficult for historians and anthropologists, archaeologists. It's very difficult, even when it was not illegal, right? Before any laws are passed, but especially after laws are passed, it's very difficult to track how common abortion was. Why? Because safe, successful abortions can be pretty invisible. So actually this should say we're invisible. Oh, we're not visible. Okay, I did put it correctly. So they're pretty invisible, right? If, for example, after laws are passed, people were just not talking about it. People were, especially when it was illegal, they wouldn't even write it in their diaries. You have instances of people who have abortions and they're not going to tell anybody, right? Other than the person who performed the abortion, or maybe nobody else knows. So most safe, successful abortions, we don't hear about. Like there's no written record of it. It's not in a letter. It's not in a diary. It's not in the courtroom. It's not in police records. It's nowhere to be found for historians. What we do have is the stories of people who were caught. And we do know that most people who have abortions are never prosecuted for it, right? Because if it happens safely, how are the cops going to find out? Like seriously, when a safe, successful abortion occurs, how will the police get involved? If they don't know it occurred, they can't get involved. So most of the time, when police get involved, they're getting involved because something went wrong. right? So typically there's two things that could go wrong here. One, after an illegal abortion, if there's hemorrhaging, too much bleeding, and the person goes to the hospital. Well, you go to the hospital. If you go to a hospital, then sometimes that's the end of the story. You get treatment for the hemorrhaging, and you go back home. But if you went to a doctor or if there's a nurse that suspects an abortion has occurred, they would call the cops. So if the medical professionals call the authorities, then that's where we hear the stories, right? Because now there's a record of the police investigating a suspected abortion. Even that is really tricky, though, because the police can be called by the medical professionals, but it was really hard for police departments and for lawyers to prove that an abortion had occurred unless the person confessed. Why is it hard? Because abortions look like miscarriages. The authorities, unless there's a confession and there's hemorrhaging occurring, cannot prove that it was induced, that it was a deliberate abortion and not a miscarriage. Miscarriages and abortions look the same. So, another a complication that could occur and might get the authorities involved would be an partial abortion. If the person goes to somebody who doesn't know what they're doing or tries to do the abortion themselves, then they might not do a good job with it because so what would happen sometimes is that whoever did the abortion didn't complete it. They only partially removed everything in the uterus. That is really dangerous because the same reason miscarriages, incomplete miscarriages are dangerous, because now the pregnant person has fetal tissue left in the uterus and it can lead to an infection. And if the infection goes untreated, it leads to death. So for some people that occurred because they were too afraid to go to the doctor with enough time for anything to happen, for medical intervention to occur. And so by the time they do go to the doctor, by the time they're found, it's too late and there's a death. And then the authorities would get involved trying to figure out who performed the abortion and trying to build a case. So what ends up happening then in the 20th century is you had these cases every so often that were really dramatic. And that served as a warning to people, like, don't go looking for an abortion because you're going to die. And that creates a false perception of how dangerous abortions are. Now, don't get me wrong. Illegal, especially self-induced abortions can be really dangerous. They could be at the time, they could be today. But actually, most abortions we suspect, right? We don't have exact numbers, but are safe and successful. The problem is a lot of cases of the abortions going wrong were so dramatic, just so dramatic, which shows kind of the desperation that pregnant people sometimes found themselves in. There was a case in 1923, and this isn't even the most dramatic case, but at the time it made a lot of headlines. In 1923, there was a boy in Boston who discovers a suitcase floating on the river. And the kid thinks he's hit the jackpot because this is during Prohibition. So he thinks a suitcase on the river means there's alcohol in the suitcase. So he fishes the suitcase out of the river. And when he opens it, he finds a young woman's mutilated corpse. So this young woman had been chopped up into pieces. When the coroner did the autopsy, the reporting was that the coroner found that the young woman had had a partial abortion, that an unfinished abortion had occurred. And so the story that is told about this young woman was that she probably went to, the reporting says, a doctor. I don't know how they would know that the woman went to a specifically to a doctor, but they said she went to a doctor and that the abortion went wrong. She died, and that the doctor chopped her up to hide the evidence of the illegal abortion. And this kind of story was like a morality story to warn women, especially, that you can't even trust a doctor. Things could go wrong. What's really interesting in some of these stories too is that when there was a case, right, sometimes the people would confess. they're on a hospital bed, they think they're going to die, and they'd confess that they had an abortion. So sometimes we do see cases, court cases of women being tried for an illegal abortion all over the US. Well, in most of these cases, it turns out the courts didn't want to punish the women. They just didn't. And this is true, by the way, all over the world. When you have cases of women being prosecuted for the crime of abortion and it goes to a jury, juries tended to sympathize with the women. When the women got on the stand and they described why they had wanted an abortion, juries tended to understand and they tended to not punish the women. In the US, we see this really interesting phenomenon of sexism actually helping some women. Women were seen as naive and brainwashed, basically not strong enough to be responsible for the abortion. Which is really like not the case. We know that women who were seeking abortion, like especially if they're going to someone who is not a medical professional, or if they're doing it themselves, they're pretty desperate. Usually at the time a woman would get to that point, they've already tried at least one other alternative. Usually a woman would first go to a doctor, ask for the abortion. Typically what would happen is the doctor would ask for too much money. So if you can't afford that, then you're looking for some of these other alternatives. Or if you don't know that a doctor, like that you just have to pay a doctor enough to do it, then you might be looking at some of these less reputable ways of finding an abortion. And so it's taking very deliberate steps to get an abortion. But in the courtrooms, especially wealthier women, they just needed a lawyer to come in and make the case that the woman was too naive and brainwashed, that it was somebody else's fault. It's the doctor's fault. It's the abortionist's fault. It's the man that got her pregnant's fault. It's always somebody else's fault. And typically women would not be punished severely for the crime of abortion. The idea was that the law existed, these anti-abortion laws existed to protect women from unlicensed quacks, right? Because the women were too weak-willed, too weak-minded to really understand what they were doing. So sexism could work in a woman's favor in some of these court cases. But like I said, enforcing the law was and is very difficult. When an illegal abortion is occurring, it's not occurring in public, right? It's most often happening after a death, or and most deaths connected to an abortion are occurring after an infection as a result of an incomplete abortion. There was another workaround that a lot of American women found, especially white women. What we see in the court records was that a lot of white women in the US, if they lived close enough to Mexico, could go to Mexico for an abortion. So in California, for example, there's almost every court case of a woman being prosecuted for the crime of an abortion was a white woman. This is not because Latina women were not getting abortions, right? Or not because Asian American women and Black women were not getting abortions. What seems to be happening is, one, the law, right? Law enforcement, police departments, lawyers cared more about regulating white women and stopping white women from getting those abortions. They cared more about that. Why don't they care about all the Latina women, the Asian American women, the Black women? Why weren't they prosecuting those cases, do you think? Why do they care less about the other groups? They are yeah, exactly. It's this racist attitude. Remember that in some parts they're actually sterilizing, they're actively preventing these ethnic and racial minority women from having children. So they're particularly interested in prosecuting and stopping white women from getting abortions. But in places like California, it was really hard to prosecute some of these abortions. Oh yeah, no, and I'll talk about that as well, Robert. Yeah, it's an interesting thing. They could go to Mexico. Now, abortions were illegal in Mexico at the time. It's not until more recently where that has been changing in Mexico. However, right, and especially in border towns, you can find almost anything you want in places like Tijuana and Ciudad Juarez, right? Like border towns are notorious for a lot of fluidity and for a lot of openly breaking the law. So, for example, you could go to Tijuana and there were clinics that advertised the fact that they provided abortion. And so women in California, Tijuana's not that far away. They drive to Tijuana, get the abortion in Tijuana, come back. Well, the women that were typically were prosecuted for the crime of the abortion and did this, it would be usually because they come back and they're hemorrhaging, or they went to somebody who didn't know what they were doing in Tijuana, and now they're in trouble, and the courts found out. So, except we have some of these cases of women arrested for an abortion or for a suspected abortion, and they would tell the cops, I have an abortion, I had it in Mexico. That created that legal problem because, well, okay, the woman broke the law. The abortion was illegal in Mexico. They broke American law too, but they didn't do it in the US. So how could courts could not prosecute women who had their abortions in Mexico? Like, how would they? They couldn't even go, find witnesses, things like that. Nothing. So it was a bit of a workaround for it because, U.S. law has no jurisdiction in Mexico, and Mexican authorities were not going to come find the women to prosecute them or extradite them, or no. So it ends up being a kind of loophole. There were also sometimes groups of people, organizations would organize, they would rent a bus or they would do a caravan every so often to take people who wanted an abortion to Tijuana. That was quite common in California, for example. There was also doctors who everyone knew were providing abortions. Some specialized in it. Now, the reason why some doctors were performing abortions varies. Some doctors did it because they wanted to help. They wanted to help these women who were oftentimes desperate for an abortion. Other doctors did it to make money. There was actually a set of clinics in California that were organized by a businessman. Specifically, these clinics existed only to do abortions, and it was part of a business deal. This businessman was trying to make money by providing abortions because he knew you could charge quite a bit for an abortion, and people would be willing to pay it. So he would hire doctors that knew how to do the abortion and would perform the abortion. Most of the time in those instances, because the clinic existed only to provide abortion, the cops knew, politicians knew, lawmakers knew that these clinics existed and that they were only performing abortions. And most of the time, depending on the year, like nothing was done. There was be no arrest. No one was trying to shut down these clinics. There were times, especially after some of this dramatic incident of like if there was a really publicized case of a dramatic abortion, then sometimes some of the clinics would be shut down after that. And they would spring back up somewhere else. But why do you think for periods of time, the cops would know that these clinics existed and not shut them down? Why would the cops just ignore a clinic openly providing what was at the time an illegal abortion? Any ideas? Like it was actually quite common all over the country that the people knew where these were happening. And at times, bribes, yes. So sometimes it would be bribes. Yeah, the cops would be paid off. Also, most of those abortions were completely safe and successful. And the other thing, Robert, is that sometimes it was the wives, the lovers, the daughters of policemen, of politicians. Actually, some of these abortion clinics in California, they were notorious. They had client information for female relatives of like really important politicians. And as a result, the cops knew, hey, the wife of this politician has gotten an abortion at this clinic. So if we shut the clinic down and start looking through the records, those names will come up. The names of really important people will come up. And we don't want that. That would lead to a bigger case, then the politicians get involved, and basically nobody wanted to touch that hot mess. Also, the cops sometimes took their lovers, wives, significant others to get an abortion at these clinics. So it was one of those open secrets. Everybody or a lot of people knew where to find it and how it was done. You just needed the money. You just needed the money to pay for a doctor to perform it. And it was easy to access. That creates, though, a class issue, right? So if you were a wealthy person, you were more likely then to get access to a safe abortion. If you could not pay the price that some of these doctors were asking, that's where things got complicated. And some people, you might know a midwife or some woman in the community, typically it's a woman who has either performed an abortion on herself or has performed several abortions, and then you could go to them for it. If the person knows what they're doing, if they're being sanitary, things could go well. If the person doesn't know what they're doing, then things can go wrong. Or, in the more desperate occasion, people would try to perform the abortion on themselves, right? This is where the image of the wire hangers, like people would use, there were some people in the 20th century that used wire hangers to perform the abortion on themselves. That was highly dangerous, because if you don't know what you're doing, one, you're going to hurt with a wire hanger. The chances of cutting something you're not supposed to be cutting inside the uterus, cutting the uterus walls, hitting something else are higher. And also, there's no guarantee that you're going to, like everything, all the fetal tissue is going to come out. And so the chances of a hemorrhage and a complication became much higher. But again, it speaks to the kind of desperation some people were in for an abortion, that they were willing to do that. There was all these myths at the time, right, of who was seeking abortions and what abortions looked like. right? Very common myth that is still, like, a lot of people still think today, was that the typical person seeking an abortion was a single young woman seduced by a villain, right? That young women were very susceptible to like older married men or just older men who seduces the young woman, gets her pregnant, and now is unwilling to take responsibility, won't marry her, won't take care of the baby. Well, those stories did happen, but they were not the typical person seeking an abortion. We know from the cases in the courtrooms and other stuff we've been able to glean, and it's actually still true today, that the majority of people who seek abortions are married, between the ages of 25 and 45 years old, so they're not young or super young. And the typical person who seeks an abortion also already has kids. It's typically a married woman, somewhere between 25 and 45, who already has kids. And the reason that they are seeking an abortion is because, well, the most common reason is they cannot afford another baby, cannot afford another child. There was also reasons of I don't want another baby. Health reasons. If the previous pregnancies have taken a significant toll on the health of the pregnant person, if they have other health complications and they just cannot be pregnant again, then those were some of the most common reasons why people would seek an abortion. So it's usually not because the person who impregnated them is not going to marry them and not going to take care of the babies. Most of these women are already married and already have children. They just can't afford another one. The other thing was that about deaths, right? That the myth that existed in the early 20th century was that that abortions were really dangerous and that you were going to die from an abortion. Well, no, actually, we estimate, based on the numbers we have and the cases we have, that actually most abortions were probably successful and safe, and that's why we don't know about them. And most of the deaths were actually a result of self-induced abortion. So when the person would perform the abortion themselves, on themselves, that's when most deaths occurred, right? But some of them could be really invisible. So it's a really hard thing to track for authorities and for historians when abortions are occurring. I do want to distinguish here when I'm saying self-induced, that's different than self-managed. That term self-managed, you might have seen around. Activists use that word, abortion providers use that word, that phrase today, because most abortions in the United States today are self-managed, meaning you do go to an abortion provider and you get a prescription for mifepristone and misoprostol, sometimes one of each, or one pill of mifepristone and 2 of misoprostol. It can depend, but you're given the pill by the abortion provider, and you take the first pill maybe at the clinic, but the second one can be at home, or you can take all these pills at home. So like what some people are doing today is ordering the pills and having them, because they have a pretty long shelf life, and just saving them in case they ever need them. Those are self-managed abortions. So the majority of abortions in the US today are self-managed. Like, you're using medicine, these pills, but they don't require a medical professional be there. So they're totally safe. Those are the most common ones. That's different than self-induced. The self-induced ones that were happening in the 20th century and the 19th century are happening with things like wire hangers, or people injecting dangerous liquids into themselves. And those are the ones that are could be harmful, right? The self-managed are not. That's a different thing. I just want to point out. So, okay, then we get to Roe v. Wade. one of the stories that leads to the Roe v. Wade case, and in fact, where the name comes from of Roe, was Jane Roe. Jane Roe. So initially, in all the court records, she is just called Jane Roe, the Jane Roe case. And it turns out after the decision, the Roe v. Wade decision in the U.S., she makes herself known publicly. She comes out, she says, I was Jane Roe of the Roe v. Wade case. Her actual name was Norma McCorvey. The Roe v. Wade case was a case that challenged Texas law prohibiting abortions. Actually, Texas law at the time was more lenient than it is in Texas today. In Texas, you could get an abortion if there was a medical necessity, for example. And Norma McCorvey already had 2 children. She was pregnant again, and she goes to the doctors to try to get a medical abortion. The doctors denied the abortion. They said it was not a medical necessity. And so she allows her story to be used to challenge Texas law. Now, the Roe v. Wade case is decided too late to make a difference in her story. She doesn't get the abortion. She carries the pregnancy to term and actually gives up the child to adoption, which is actually not what usually happens after somebody is denied an abortion. So that was actually a rarity, that she actually gives the child up for adoption. She becomes really famous because she comes out after the Roe v. Wade decision and becomes a pro-choice activist. She actually worked for some time as a clinic escort, escorting women from their cars into abortion clinics to protect them from the protesters that are sometimes outside of abortion providers' locations. But within a couple of years after the Roe v. Wade decision, she changes her political position and she becomes a pro-life activist. And she goes on television. She actually spends decades as a pro-life activist, going on TV, saying that she believed that Roe v. Wade needed to be overturned. She died a couple of years ago, so she didn't actually see Roe v. Wade be overturned. Does anybody know anything about Norma McCorvey? No, she's a really interesting figure. I'm like, because of the switcheroo.
Did they use you?
Oh, sorry. Because of this, her switching.
Did they use you as a?
Sorry, because she kept switching positions, right? So at first she was by the way, she would go on TV, give interviews, talk about her situation, the situation she had been in, and promoting a pro-choice political position. Then she becomes extremely active as a pro-life activist, going on TV, talking about the religious conversion she had and making the case that Roe v. Wade should be overturned. Well, right before she died a couple of years ago, she was interviewed for a documentary. The documentary is available for free. By the way, don't pay YouTube. It's available for free on Hulu. It's called AKA Jane Roe. And this documentary was explosive when it came out because most of us today don't know her name, but at the time in the 70s and 80s, she was really well known because she was Jane Roe. She comes out in this documentary and she says that she lied, that she went on TV and she promoted the pro-life cause because she was getting paid. So I'm going to play, this is part of the interview she gives in the documentary in which she explains, I lied. And then, so let's watch this and then we'll have a few minutes to talk about it at the end.
The trophy?
Of course. I was the big fish. I was the big fish.
Do you think they would say that you used them?
Well, I think it was a mutual thing. You know, I took their money and they put me out in front of the cameras and told me what to say. That's what I'd say.
Wow.
I took their money and they put me out in front of the cameras and told me what to say. That's what I'd say.
Give me an example of what you'd say.
We've gathered here today to pay homage to the children that are being aborted in this abortuary. We're doing this because abortion is wrong. And I, as the former Jane Roe of Roe versus Wade, do regret signing the affidavit for the pro-abortion camps. That was probably about it.
It was all an act.
Yeah. I did it well, too. I am a good actress. Of course, I'm not acting now. I did it well, too.
That really hurts because Jakes.
I'm going to stop it there. We can watch more of that that interview when we come back for Thanksgiving break. But I wanted to play it because we'll dig more into that story because it's really interesting. She was actually used by both sides, by both the pro-choice and the pro-life movement tried to use her as a symbol. And this is the problem. Whenever one person becomes the face of something, then your life is completely open to the world in a way that impacted her. So she talks about, for example, not being able to find a job after she comes out as Jane Roe. Oh, Brian, that's a great question. The people reacting were one, the feminist, pro-choice, one of the pro-choice activists, and the man was one of the leaders of the pro-life organization she worked for. That's why we'll come back to her, because that man will actually admits that the organization was using her. He said, we were using her. And he'll explain more about his feelings about her, but and then some of the women that had worked with her in the pro-choice movement are also interviewed, and everybody was just shocked that she said that it was all an act. So I'll come back to that. Like I said, I wanted. So the Roe v. Wade case itself is really interesting for the personal stories that come out of that case. Hers was not the only story that was used to sue Texas, but she was the most famous because she was very public in her activism. But she also is an example of how people switch their opinions all the time. For whatever reason, she was doing it, she says, for money, but people change their opinion on this topic all the time. And then there's people like Joe Biden. I used to use him as an example a lot because before he was president, because he is Catholic. He's Catholic, and he believes that he used to be very open about talking about how he believed abortion was wrong, but he believed that it should be legally available, that it should be legal. He was one of the, and this is actually a common position for a lot, like the reason why so many people in surveys today say that Roe v. Wade, that abortion should be legal, is a lot of people have that position of, I would never have one. I believe it's wrong, it's murder, or it's sin, but I think it should be legal. That's a really common position, and it makes for an interesting alliance of groups, and we'll see how that ends up shaping the legality of this in the future. But okay, I need to stop and say if you have any questions, especially about the history. This is my area of expertise, so like I don't want to get too carried away. I will want to let you ask questions if you have them. we will look, like I said, about the actual like legality, the Supreme Court decisions, the Roe v. Wade, and then the more recent Dobbs. Because again, the way they use history in those decisions is really interesting and sometimes wrong, and sometimes correct. So we'll dig a little bit there. And we'll talk a little more about that racial disparity, right? That every issue we can see the way things impact different racial and ethnic groups differently. Robert asked, do you think Democrats hold abortion hostage regularly to gain ransom votes and donations? I don't think the Democrats are that smart or strategic. But there is something to be said about some of the pro-choice organizations like NARAL and Planned Parenthood are oftentimes, I think, are being very cynical in the way they fundraise money and what they actually do. So for example, Planned Parenthood is in trouble amongst pro-choice activists right now because they've been trying to prevent a union of their workers from forming. And they're notorious, Planned Parenthood is notorious for not being a great place to work. So the hours, the burden, the benefits they get don't tend to be very good. And it's really cynical because they fundraise, they raise a lot of money on the image they have. People trust them, and yet their behavior doesn't align all the time with the things they will publicly say when they're raising money. So I'm like, I can't. I think the Democrats are sometimes too dumb, but some of these organizations, I think, are the ones that are holding the topic ransom to raise money. Yeah. Oh, I'm like, now you're asking me for my opinion, and I'm going to get really controversial.